This week we are going to talk about critical reading. Critical reading is not just reading the literal word for word information in front of you. It's not just reading between the lines, but it is reading what is stated and unstated by the author to figure out what the author is saying. Interpreting facts along with the author's attitude, using implied meaning to make accurate assumptions, and drawing accurate conclusions. Critical reading involves a higher level of sophistication in reading. Through analyzing facts, opinions, and biased statements, by synthesizing groups of supporting statements to summarize or paraphrase, bringing individual clarity to the piece read, and by evaluating the information, how the information fits into the reader's historical perspective, and if it meets the standards of critical reading. So when you are reading a text, you've got to look for facts and be able to tell the difference between facts and opinions. You have to identify the author's bias, and the author always has a bias. And then you have to pull together lots of ideas and supporting statements from several parts of the text or several texts so that you can summarize or paraphrase and bring an individual and unique idea to the piece that you read. And part of that involves things that you've already read in other classes, things you've watched on television, and life experiences. First, you need to read the introduction. You've got to figure out what the author's purpose of writing is. So what does the author want to accomplish? What is the thesis statement? If you can't find the thesis statement, you got to go back and look because you need to be able to tell what this piece that you're reading is all about. You need to determine the intended audience. Are you the intended audience, or is the audience supposed to be kids under 15? And in order to do that, you need to think about the tone of what you're reading, the style, how much information is given, and what assumptions the author makes about the reader. A lot of times this is determined by the vocabulary. And is what you're reading appropriate for what you need to research? Readers write for three basic reasons: to inform, to persuade, or to entertain. When authors write to inform, they usually will provide definitions. They'll describe a report or a process. They recount a story. They'll give historical background. They'll provide facts and figures. Your textbooks are written to inform. So how do you evaluate informative writing as a reader? You have to decide if the information is accurate. Are the facts that they have presented backed up by credible research and from credible authorities on the subject? And you need to try to determine if the content of the source is fact, opinion, or propaganda. If you think the source is offering facts, are the sources for those facts clearly indicated? To persuade. In this style of writing, the language is always emotionally charged. The thesis must be debatable. This is going to look like the kind of papers you need to write in this class because you have to write persuasive papers. And there are a few strategies that will help you identify and evaluate persuasive writing. Clearly defined terms. Because a thesis statement is arguable, most academic essays are also arguable, which means persuasive. Are keywords defined? Do they need to be? Fair use of information. This has to do with you evaluating the sources that go into the article or the text or the essay. Do you think there's enough evidence offered? Is the coverage comprehensive? Are you getting a full idea of the argument, or is there something big that's left out or that's not sitting right with you? Are there broad generalizations that overstate or oversimplify the matter? For example, are there lots of references to everybody and they and the all-knowing experts agree? Those don't count unless we know who the experts are, who they are, and who everybody is. Does the author use a good mix of primary and secondary sources of information? Primary is actually when the reader goes to a text and actually quotes it. Secondary sources are the sources that are written about the primary sources. So if you are going to write a paper in literature, the primary source is going to be that book that you're writing the paper about. The secondary sources are going to be like journal articles that help you make your argument about what you're saying about that book. If the source is opinion, does the author offer sound reasons for adopting that stance? So anything you read that's persuasive is going to be debatable, which means you may agree with it or you may not agree with it. And it is an opinion. So when the author supports the reasoning for the argument that he or she makes, is that argument sound, or do you see holes in it? And you again have to consider those questions about the author. Is this person reputable? Should I trust this writer or not? You need to look at how timely the source is. Are you reading a source that's over 20 years old? Now, sometimes this doesn't matter, but a lot of times it does. Some information becomes dated when new research is available, but other older sources of information can be quite sound 50 or 100 years later. So, for example, if you are going to write about technology, you would not want to look at articles written about technology in the 1980s because the technology in the 1980s is completely different than the technology now. So any studies that were done about technology are outdated. However, if you're going to write about Sigmund Freud in psychology or Nietzsche in philosophy, you're going to look at older sources because they do not get out of date. No new information comes about. Perhaps new takes on information does, but actual sources are still the same. How credible is the author? If the document is anonymous, what does that tell you about the organization? So for example, if you read an article online that has a .gov URL, that means it's written by some part of the government, and the government rarely gives credit to one individual. So what do you know about that organization? If you're going to look at an article on healthcare.gov, what does healthcare.gov do? What is their function? Is there anything about that site that might be biased one way or the other? You have to decide. Are the arguments very one-sided with no acknowledgement of other viewpoints? In any argument, the writer has to acknowledge the opposing view and rebut it. And that just means they have to say what the other side thinks and why or why not they should think that. So now we get into logical fallacies. If you're taking a philosophy course, some of this is going to overlap a little bit. Logical fallacies are philosophical errors in evaluating arguments. If you argue a point based on a logical fallacy, your reader will not be persuaded and you will not be seen as an authority. Emotionally loaded terms are not wrong, and they're actually a cornerstone of persuasive writing, but you've got to be able to get behind it. When you think about family values, you don't just think about one small thing. Several ideas come to your head. And you must be very careful about how they are used. Are they deceptive or hiding essential facts? Ad hominem. This is attacking the person who stated the argument rather than the argument's merit. For example, I could more easily accept my opponent's plan to increase revenues by collecting on delinquent tax bills if he had paid more than $100 in state taxes in each of the past 3 years. But the fact is, he's a millionaire with a millionaire's tax shelters. This man hasn't paid a wooden nickel for the state services he and his family depend on. So I ask you, is he the one to be talking about taxes to us? The person who wrote this is simply stating that we can't trust this person because he's a millionaire. But that has nothing to do with whether or not you can trust him or whether or not that millionaire has anything worthwhile to say about taxes. Faulty cause and effect. Assuming that because two items happened one after the other, that those two events are linked. I call this the werewolf argument. So for example, last night there was a full moon and I could not sleep. Therefore, the moon kept me awake. Now there's two ways that this could be true. It could be true if I'm a werewolf, which we pretty much agree are not real creatures. Or if for some reason my bed aligns perfectly with my window and the light of the moon shines in my eyes. Okay. But other than that, the two things are not linked. The fact that I cannot sleep is not linked to the full moon. Either or reasoning. This is similar to faulty cause and effect because it's unwilling to recognize the complexity of the argument. For example, research in gene splicing is at a crossroads. Either scientists will be carefully monitored by civil authorities and their efforts limited to acceptable applications, such as disease control, or lacking regulatory guidelines, scientists will set their own ethical standards and begin programs in embryonic manipulation that, however well intended, exceed the proper limits of human knowledge. So this argument is taking something very controversial, scientific research, and saying it's either one way or it's the other. But with an argument that talks about regulating certain types of research, you've got a whole lot more going on in there. You've got a lot of gray area that could influence one side or the other. It's not just a black or white situation. Hasty generalization. This is drawing a conclusion from too little evidence or from unrepresentative evidence. For example, Smith, who is from England, decides to attend graduate school at Ohio State University. He has never been to the U.S. before. The day after he arrives, he is walking back from an orientation session and sees two white albino squirrels chasing each other around a tree. In his next letter home, he tells his family that American squirrels are white. He has rushed to his opinion, a hasty generalization, so going too fast to the conclusion. He has decided because he saw two white squirrels that all American squirrels are white. False analogy. Misapplying the conclusion from one argument to another argument. There were wonderful psychologists who passed away several decades ago. If they could be effective in what they did without reading any of the studies or other articles that have been published in the last several decades, there's no need for me to read any of those works in order to be effective. So, the explanation here. There are several theories related to all fields of studies, and not all theories are equally credited by all practitioners. So, I guess, for example, this argument this student is giving is, I don't need to read anything that's been written about Freud because I already read Freud. But that's not necessarily true. You cannot assume that by reading the original document that you understand everything about what was written either before or since. Begging the question, to assume as a proven fact the very thesis being argued. Okay, if such actions were not illegal, then they would not be prohibited by law. Illegal and prohibited by law are the same thing. So you can't say if something was illegal, then it would not be illegal. Doesn't make sense. Non sequitur. This is Latin for it does not follow. It describes a conclusion that does not follow logically from the premise. For example, I hear the rain falling outside my window, therefore the sun is not shining. This doesn't necessarily follow because there have been lots of times where we see the sun shining and it rains. Oversimplification. Offering too easy solutions to a complicated problem. For example, if we want to end substance abuse, let's send every drug user to prison for life. Okay, there's a whole lot more involved in substance abuse than just stopping that one person who's using the drugs or the alcohol inappropriately. There's the issue of the person who's getting the drugs to that person. There's the whole science of addiction. Now, the last author's purpose is writing to entertain. When an author writes to entertain, it's not only to make people laugh. For example, we watch dramas on TV. We watch reality TV. Reality TV is not necessarily intended to make us laugh, although I'm sure some of it is. Some of it is intended to bring on other emotions, which also falls into the category of entertain. So anything that brings up a happy or sad emotion, either one, will work. So what do you think? You must form an opinion about absolutely everything that you read. You use your evaluation of the author's purpose to form that opinion. By analyzing the source and points of the arguments, you can determine if the argument is sound. And this is the final step in critical reading.